Good evening. In this fourth and final episode of our series on the historical essence of Marxism, we will deal with the last phase of capitalism. Last phase which, according to Marx, is imperialism, the end goal of capitalism. Again, as much as it is possible in the context of this presentation, the intent is not to defend, promote, accuse, excuse or justify an ideology. The objective, rather, is to clarify the essential points of the Marxist historical theory of economics, and to see if, however roughly, what has happened and happens under our eye and in our time, to see if the theory agrees with the practice. That is, whether it agrees with what happened down to our days. In these episodes, we have followed the main stages of historical capitalism, from competition among producers and merchants to consolidations of the means of production into monopolies. Today we prefer to call them conglomerates or multinationals or cartels. These words fall more gently on the ear than monopolies, but they amount to the same thing. The next step after the formation of monopolies is the stage of finance capital, where the interests of manufacturing and banking combine into monopolies of a higher order, so to speak. At first, monopolies were centered or grouped around national states. The objective of finance capital is, or at least was at first, to export capital to other typically colonizable or colonized countries where the returns are astronomical. And we briefly explained why profits are high in the previous episodes in the colonized countries. Eventually, the earth ran out of lands to colonize, and pretty much the world was divided among four powers: England, the US, Germany, and France. We are talking more or less of the beginning of the 20th century. But finance capital entities cannot coexist peacefully. The war of 1914-1918, first of all, was imperialistic, that is, predatory, annexationist, and plunderous. It was a war for the division of the world, for the partition or repartition of colonies or of sphere of influence of a finance capital. The proof of the nature of the war is to be found not in the diplomatic history of the war itself, but in an analysis of the objective position of the ruling classes in all belligerent countries. And to the extent that in the previous 19th century the communications and means of production were more limited than in the years of the First World War, the American Civil War could also be considered as an imperialist war insofar as the finance capital of the North could not give up on the tremendous opportunities offered by the South. The problem in these cases, and even now to our days, is that what appears is not what is, or rather, given the intricate ramification and connections of the financial and capitalists' interests involved, it is much easier to sell a war to the people who are going to die in it, to sell the war under a flag or a theory, or rather, if you like, an ideology. Flag, theory, ideology are all more easily understandable than the generic concept of finance capital. Let us remember once more that Marxism is a historical method that includes in its study both people and economy. And the more invisible or complicated is the economy, the easier it is to convince people that profit is not a motive for war, but unfortunately it is. Let's consider, as I was saying, the American Civil War. Most of us, when we think about it, associate it with the abolition of slavery, a concept easy to understand, and it makes sense. It is only when we start looking at it in more detail that the finance capital aspect becomes more evident, therefore supporting the Marxian theory of history, which shows that even critical agreements, even constitutional agreements, fall by the wayside when the economic interests come into conflict. In the instance, the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation gave the right to any of the states to secede from the Union if they wanted to. But at the time of the Civil War, the finance capital entity of the North could not afford or did not want to be excluded from the opportunity of finance capital in the South. That slavery became the historical emblem, so to speak, of the Civic War is good and gives a kind of ideological absolution to the war after the fact. But that does not alter the historical evidence of the reason why 650,000 people died, a reason which was much more economic than ideological. To further support the point, 50 years later, the reasons for America to join World War I against the Germans from the national historical interest point of view were nil, were zero. Germany never threatened nor wanted to invade America or curtail any of her rights. But the finance capital entities in America were strongly linked to those of England. Therefore, it was important to camouflage their motives by inventing the evil nature of the Germans, suddenly calling them Huns to suggest a link between Germany and the hordes of Attila. And, of course, no one knew or could even remotely imagine that the social structure of Germany was, at the time, the most advanced in Europe, offering, for example, unemployment and healthcare benefit to her citizens. As Marxist theories have been interpreted by followers and scholars, there have been several variants and interpretation. In particular, there have been tendency towards the so-called pacifist and generically democratic interpretation of capitalism. They are spurious, or if you like, they are heretical derivation of the original Marxist theory, simply because these interpretations obscure the profundity of the contradictions inherent in capitalism and its inevitable drift towards imperialism. Imperialism that uses war to bring peace and exports democracy at the cost of the lives of millions. The Marxist interpretation of history predicts imperialism to be the last phase of capitalism. And during this process and evolution, capitalism decays into a form of parasitism. However, we may not want to admit it, but we have evidence of this under our own eyes. How other than parasitism can we call the grotesque enrichment of a tiny fraction of mankind not by labor, but by the simple manipulation of printed paper? Manipulation described or referred to by fancy names such as derivatives, futures, collateralized debt obligations, etc. Furthermore, for the reasons explained before, the highest profits possible are obtained by the export of capital under the auspices of large financial institutions. Which is why any country that does not wish to comply with the financial enslavement associated with the import of capital must be eliminated and physically destroyed as a country. Once more, let's repeat that the Marxist analysis of history treats economy and people as separate items of analysis. But, in reality, of course, economy and people cannot even theoretically be considered as separate. And this inseparability generates the sort of blackmail conducted by the prevailing class against the opposite class in the class struggle. Therefore, to quote a recent example, when the prevailing class finds difficulty in the export of capital and, by so doing, difficulty in imposing economic hegemony, the prevailing class did not say, now I'm going to destroy your country and kill 1.5 million people, as it happened in Iraq, because you don't want to import my capital. This would be the economic side of the Marxist analysis. Rather, the prevailing class finds any number of imaginative excuses easily accepted by the populace, thanks also, of course, to the monopolistic control of the information channels. In Iraq, it was the weapons of mass destruction. In Libya, the most prosperous country in Africa, where resources were socialized, Gaddafi was resisting the mercenary army that the prevailing Western class sent to Libya to destroy him.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
And that is why imperialism, the last phase of capitalism, ends up with results like this in Libya, which require no further explanation. The situation is in principle almost identical to that which we spoke about in the first section of this series on the essence of Marxism, as regards the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. Marxist analysis separates the economic view from the moral or religious view, although they are inextricably interconnected. But in the final analysis, Marxism maintains that the economic component of war, and by extension of the component of the class struggle, is the primary cause of the struggle itself. Now, why, someone may ask, a situation so simple and logical to understand cannot be perceived at large, and why do things continue as they do with endless war and consequent destruction? The explanation is historical. Given the enormous super profit possible through export capital, it has been possible to bribe the labor leaders and the upper stratum of the strata of the labor aristocracy. Up to a point, the capitalists of the advanced countries could bribe the unions in many different ways: direct, indirect, overt, and covert. This stratum or strata of workers used to be, and some still are, quite Philistine in their mode of life, their earnings and their outlook. They act as the principal social support of the bourgeoisie, and they are the real agents of the bourgeoisie in the labor movement, the labor, if you like, the labor lieutenants of the capitalists. In the struggle between the working class and the bourgeoisie, they stand by the bourgeoisie. They are the lieutenant of the 1%. We can see this even today, though of course the mainstream media has to be silent about it. The decisions of the big union leaders are often against the will of the majority of the members, but are imposed upon them by no small degree of intimidation. Now back to our main theme. The transformation of free competition into monopoly is probably the most important phenomenon of modern capitalist economy. Though when Marx was writing Das Kapital, free competition appeared to most economists to be a kind of a natural law. Official science tried, by a conspiracy of silence, nothing new here, to kill the works of Marx. His analysis showed that free competition gives rise to the concentration of production, which in turn at a certain point leads to monopoly. And economists have written many books attempting to prove that monopolies are not really monopolies, therefore refuting the Marxist theory. But facts are stubborn things. They have to be reckoned with, whether we like it or we like them or not. In Europe, the time when the new capitalism finally superseded the old style of capitalism can be established with reasonable precision. It was the beginning of the 20th century. Now, the general public takes it for granted that large spheres of economic life have been, as a general rule, systematically removed from the realm of free competition. Monopolies, or cartels, come to an agreement on the conditions of sale, terms of payment, etc. And they divide the markets among themselves. They fix the quantity of goods to be produced, they fix prices and how to divide the profits among the various enterprises. And one of the glaring example of price fixing and cartels is of course oil production, where, irrespective of what may be said in certain circles, the law of supply and demand, the magic hand of the market, to quote the famous phrase by Adam Smith, the magic hand of the market has been lopped off. For capitalism, in its imperialist phase, represents the stage of the most complete socialization of production. And in spite of themselves, the capitalists are dragged, as it were, into a new social order, a transitional social order from complete free competition to complete socialization. Be careful though, it is not the socialization that we instinctively associate with socialism. Production becomes a social, but appropriation remains private. The social means of production remains the private property of a few. That is, the general framework of formally recognized free competition remains, but the yoke of a few monopolists on the rest of the population becomes more heavy and burdensome. And you may have heard of the sentence, socialization of the risk, privatization of the profit. And the evidence of this truth is not hard to find. Just think of one of the historical recent crises in 2008, when millions lost their homes, but the finance capital monopoly suffered no damage, and its masterminds actually got even richer through government bailouts and subsidies, literally by the trillions. All of this shows that the development of capitalism has reached a stage when, although commodity production continues to be regarded as the basis of economic life, it has in reality is not. And the big profits go to the geniuses of financial manipulation. And at the root of these swindles and manipulations lies socialized production, as I said before. But the immense progress of humanity which achieved the socialization goes to the benefit of the speculators. In other words, the domination and the violence associated with it are the relationships that are most typical of the last phase of capitalist development, which results inevitably from the old formation of all-powerful economic monopolies. In talking about domination and violence, take as one notorious example the Correction Corporation of America, the largest for-profit prison company in America. It spends about $1 million per year lobbying against cannabis legalization, marijuana. But why in heaven should they be concerned? And here is the reason in one of the letters of the company. Changes with respect to drugs and controlled substances could affect the number of persons arrested, convicted, and sentenced, thereby potentially reducing demand for correctional facilities to house them. The statement, as I may have mentioned before, perfectly represents one of the key features of any ideology. In the instance, the neoliberal ideology, the obliteration of rights and wrong as long as profit is protected. A parallel phenomenon of monopolies occurs with banking. The incorporation of numerous small intermediary banks into a handful of large financial centers represents one of the fundamental processes in the transformation of capitalism into capitalist imperialism. One glaring example of this phenomenon, which is under our eyes, is the so-called TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. That is, in fact, it is a development that even Marx did not and could not anticipate. On the one hand, the countries of Western Europe, who fought for over 100 years to gain a national independence, have essentially lost it under the Orwellian umbrella of the so-called European Union. And this loss of independence is not a theory, it is a fact. Labor laws have been rewritten against the workers, safety nets have been dismantled, services privatized and made more expensive. And just about all European countries host a number of American military bases to ensure compliance with the dictates of capitalistic imperialism. Though compliance can be imposed not necessarily and exclusively by military means, even though Obama said openly,
we occasionally have to twist the arms of countries that wouldn't do what we need them to do.
As I was saying, call it coincidence, call it conspiracy theory, but when Germany recently made noises about removing the imperialist sanctions against Russia, suddenly the Volkswagen emissions scandal breaks out in the media. The results apparently of this scandal had been dormant for a year, and even so the methods of that analysis have been questioned by several experts, but it doesn't matter. The facts are what are explained by the media. And when England made noises about leaving the European Union, suddenly the Panama offshore banking scandals breaks out, involving the British Prime Minister. What Marx could not anticipate was a remarkable inversion of roles, comparable in the physical domain, comparable to the inversion of the magnetic poles, north becoming south and vice versa. For, while until recently, at least formally, Parliament made the laws, albeit heavily, if not totally, influenced by finance capital, euphemistically called lobbying. Now with TTIP and similar other schemes, finance capital substitutes parliament. And even the tenuous fig leaf of parliamentary democracy goes the way of all flesh. Says Obama,
"We have to make sure America writes the rules of the global economy."
Are the envy of the world.
I believe America is exceptional. Exceptional. Most powerful nation on earth. If we don't write the rules for trade around the world, guess what? China will.
Which may all be very well, except that China does not have almost 1,000 military bases scattered around the world, or spends $1 trillion+ per year in military armaments and wars. Now, all this information is available and visible to anyone who wishes to see it, but it is not visible, partly because of the media monopoly and partly through the skewing of academic education. For the task of a bourgeois professor is not to lay bare the mechanics of the financial system or to divulge the machinations of the finance monopolists, but rather to present them in a favorable light. And this is hardly new. Even in the time of pre-World War I Germany, professors evaded vexing questions by vague and grandiloquent answers. Take, for example, the definition of commerce by a German university professor. Commerce is an occupation having for its object collecting goods, storing them and making them available, from which the student may conclude that commerce existed at the time of the primitive man who knew nothing about exchange, surplus value, etc. Finance capital, concentrated in a few hands and exercising a virtual monopoly, exacts enormous and ever-increasing profits from the floating of companies, issue of stock, state loans, etc. It tightens the grip of financial oligarchies and levies tribute upon the whole of society for the benefit of monopolists.
So we've become now an oligarchy instead of a democracy. And I think that's been the worst damage to the basic moral and ethical standards of America's political system that I've ever seen in my life.
Another inevitable consequence of finance capital monopolies is the concentration of monopolies in a few rich countries and eventually in one. After reaching this stage, should there be another country which refuses to acknowledge or accept to be ruled by the monopolies of another country, the result is war. Apologists of capitalism will say that by exporting capital to so-called underdeveloped countries, the standard of living in the countries where capital is exported will increase. But this is a fib, for uneven development and wretched conditions of the masses are fundamental and inevitable conditions and premises for this mode of production. As long as capitalism remains what it is, surplus capital will never be utilized for the purpose of raising the standard of living of the masses in a given country. For this would mean a declining profit for the monopolies. It will be used for the purpose of increasing those profits by exporting capital to even more backward countries. For the primary necessity for exporting capital arises from the fact that in some countries capitalism has become overripe, so to speak, and the capital cannot find a profitable investment. Of this truth, we have dramatic, even if indirect, evidence not today, notably in Europe, where a migration of biblical proportion is taking place from Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. The capital exported in third world countries has certainly not contributed to the improvement of their standard of living, otherwise they wouldn't leave. Imperialism is striving for annexation, which at first meant establishing colonies. But imperialism also strives towards violence and reaction. In the instance of Europe, the stage of colonization has been superseded by the incorporation of the individual states into, as I was saying, a so-called European Union that can dictate and impose laws on its members. The next foreseeable stage, as I was mentioning before, will be the actual official transfer of political power to finance capital, eliminating the disguise or fig leaf of parliamentary democracy. Outside Europe, finance capital is resorting to the new technique on the strategy of hybrid wars, of which color revolutions are but one aspect. For, in the short and perhaps even the long run, war is consistently a very reliable source of profit. Why is obvious, because material is produced to be destroyed, and in turn, to ensure destruction, there must be a demand for war. Furthermore, since expenses for defense are essentially limitless, so is the profit. Anyone not blinded by ideology can find ample evidence for the state of affairs by examining evidence which is available to all. In Syria, as we are recording this very episode, the US is nominally fighting ISIS while supporting, that is, sending arms to the so-called moderate groups, which are essentially indistinguishable from ISIS. Finally, if it were still necessary to bring one more proof that imperialism is the last stage of capitalism, NATO was founded on the flimsy excuse of a threatened aggression from the Soviet Union. Now, 30 years later, there is no Soviet Union, no communism, but NATO, the militaristic arm of finance capital, is stronger than ever and generates more profits than thought imaginable. What better proof could be provided for the prediction of Marx on the evolution of the class struggle? Now, I fully realize that even in 4 episodes we have hardly touched the surface of the immense research by Marx on the expressions of capitalism, but to adapt one of my favorite sayings by Dr. Johnson, no explanation is complete, but any is better than none. I am Jimmy Moglia for Historical Sketches. Thank you for watching. Good night.